An agreement between the United States and Russia to slash their nuclear arsenals is in danger of collapse after a key Republican senator said that it shouldn't be voted on this year. Will President Obama succeed in ratifying this treaty soon, or might it face greater opposition? And how would this impact on future relations between the two countries? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finnegan. President Obama faces his first test after the midterm elections, and at stake, two initiatives that he's been working towards since taking office: nuclear disarmament and better ties with Russia. On Tuesday, a prominent Republican senator said that there isn't enough time for Obama to ratify the START nuclear treaty with Russia by the end of 2010. Now, by January, a Republican-dominated Congress will be sworn in. Obama's been pushing to get Republican support to ratify the treaty, which was signed in April this year. The treaty commits the former Cold War enemies to cut their strategic warheads by about 30% within 7 years. Obama reassured his Russian counterpart, Dmitry Medvedev, about the treaty, but relations between the two countries could be further affected by the extradition of the former Soviet Air Force officer Viktor Bout from Thailand to the United States. While Russia's foreign ministry protested at the extradition, the US says that it's confident that this would have no impact on Washington's ties with Moscow. Well, joining us now, three guests. In Washington, Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations. In London, Daniel Korski, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, an analyst and columnist at the Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Daniel, we'll start with you if we can. Give us an outline of where you see US and Russian relations at the moment.
Well, relations between the United States and Russia can probably be described as steady, as workmanlike, but always with the risk of some spikiness, some change to the system that can alter otherwise good links. Which is to say that since President Obama reached out to the Russian leadership, they've been able, across the Atlantic, to form a number of agreements, to progress a number of areas that were difficult before. Yet we always see the risk, if you will, emerging of disagreement if it isn't over those very agreements, as we're seeing now, but also over issues such as Iran, such as the stabilization of Afghanistan, and of course over the issue of how Russia behaves in its immediate neighborhood. So I describe the relationship today as workmanlike, but also occasionally at risk.
Workmanlike and occasionally at risk, Pavel, in Moscow. Would you concur with that?
Oh, yeah, more or less, though I would believe that the agreement, the START agreement, in itself is not that important. It was a kind of symbol of this new relationship, and actually is seen, at least in Washington, as some concession to Russia. I mean that the United States, again, is treating Russia as the Soviet Union as an equal. The real nitty-gritty of the improved relations is more cooperation on Afghanistan and, of course, Russian support for expanded sanctions against Iran and the Russian refusal to sell Iran S-300 anti-aircraft missiles. These are the kind of the real, more or less, the real achievements. But now there are somewhat under risk as this symbolic START treaty is threatened to be bogged down in the Senate, as did the previous START II treaty.
Donald Jensen in Washington, D.C. Pavel Felgenhauer says that START isn't important. Are you concerned that that if not START, perhaps the issue of Viktor Bout could have the potential to muddy the waters somewhat in the relationship between the two countries?
Oh, they certainly would. I think both the START bogging down and the Bout case, I think, are the two largest bumps in the road in the so-called reset we've seen in the past year and a half. And while I would agree with my colleague in London, I think, his description of the relationship, I would also add the word fragile. And I think the political atmosphere in Washington has changed significantly in only 2 weeks. And I think Senator Kyle's comments yesterday show how much things have changed. It's going to be a much more difficult road ahead for Moscow and Washington.
Well, urging the Senate to ratify the New START treaty, US Vice President Joe Biden warned that the failure to do so would endanger national security. He said, without ratification of this treaty, we'll have no Americans on the ground to inspect Russia's nuclear activities, no verification regime to track Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal, less cooperation between the two nations that account for 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, and no verified nuclear reductions. Daniel Kurski in London. There is a train of thought, of course, that says that the US doesn't need a START treaty, that Joe Biden is wrong, that Russia can't afford a costly weapons program, that the US will naturally achieve strategic domination just by doing nothing. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, President Obama has made it an avowed aim of his administration to reduce the world's nuclear stockpiles. And for his administration, the agreement made at the beginning of his tenure with Russia was an important part of that. It allowed him to continue discussions with other nuclear armed states. And of course, it gave the United States, it hoped, a kind of moral leverage vis-a-vis countries such as Iran that are seeking to acquire a nuclear weapon. So for the U.S. administration, it was a very clear objective from the beginning. The extent to which, though, it'll make the world more dangerous if it doesn't happen, and the extent to which it'll put the relationship between the U.S. and Russia at risk is a lot more questionable. Nobody really today doubts or fears a nuclear confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. Of course, there is a lingering suspicion and worry in parts of the European and American security establishments that the Russians aren't in control of their nuclear arsenals in the way that they ought to be. But to say that the relationship is going to be at risk, or that there's a risk of conflict, is probably going too far, I think.
Pavel Felgenhauer, then in Moscow, to what extent is that statement about Moscow not being able to afford a weapons program anyway? Is that true?
Well, Russia is investing rather heavily in modernizing its nuclear strategic arsenal. This is seen as totally essential to keep great power status and to ensure that other powers would not infringe on what Russia sees as its rightful sphere of influence, its backyard, the so-called new abroad, the former Soviet republics. And the non-ratification, of course, of START 2, if it gets stuck in the Senate as START 2 did, this is, well, of course, will not cause an arms race. But it could very seriously impede relations. There's a constituency here in Moscow in the ruling bureaucracy which believes that Russia should have, does not need to have that good relations with the United States. That they'll point out that we told you so, that the Americans are treacherous. There again, they're pulling our nose, and maybe we should think again about how close we should be with Iran. And maybe we should really sell them some new weapons.
Donald Jensen in Washington, as Pavel said right at the beginning here, that START is not important. This issue of the prominent Republican senator saying that there simply isn't enough time to get this done in the lame duck session before the end of the year. Is START important? Are we just witnessing political horse trading here in Washington?
Good question. I would agree with Pavel. I would put it a slightly different way. It's not as important as the arms control community says it is. It's in some ways like in 1914 arguing about how many horses the cavalry needs. There are a lot of other issues now that are jostling for attention, not just START. But it's strategic, symbolically very important. And I think this is going to open the door for a lot of mischief as well in the Congress in the months to come. Two other points, though, I would add. One is that I think that those people in the Kremlin that Pavel talked about can now argue that Obama is weak. He's not worth the sacrifices that the Russians have made in the last year and a half. So what's the point in dealing with him? And I think that is likely to be the perception not only in Moscow, but elsewhere as well. There's also the problem, however, that the Republicans, if this gets bogged down, that is the START treaty, Republicans can be blamed by others for torpedoing the so-called reset button. So it's not out without political danger for the Republicans as well.
Well, since taking on the reins in 2009, President Obama has sought to reset relations with Russia and reverse what he called a dangerous drift. Stepping in that direction, he scrapped the controversial missile defense shield in Poland and the Czech Republic, the Bush-era plan that had complicated ties with Russia. Russia, on the other hand, gave Washington its much-needed support for tougher UN sanctions against Iran over its alleged nuclear ambitions. The US and Russia have also been working closely in Afghanistan. Much of the American supplies are shipped to its troops in Afghanistan through Russian territory. On the flip side, a scandal over a Russian spy ring in the US in June raised questions regarding the improved relations between the two countries. Meanwhile, Russia is concerned about energy deals between the US and some countries in Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus, which would hamper Russia's element of control over the energy sector in Europe. Daniel Korski, let me talk to you about energy in particular then. Where does energy come into all of this? How big a factor is it in the relationship between the US and Russia?
Energy is a very big factor in the relationship between Europe and Russia. And I think from the US perspective, it is more of a concern that Europe is going to be increasingly controlled via Russia's use of gas as a foreign policy tool than any kind of US concern that Russian supplies of energy will affect the US. But when it comes to the relationship between Russia and Europe, gas is incredibly important. Russian companies either control access, pipelines, or important parts of markets in Europe, and have over the last couple of years been very successful in splitting various European countries apart over their gas policy towards Russia. So from the perspective of Europe, gas is incredibly important. I think from the perspective of the Washington establishment, it is a concern that the Europeans aren't able to deal with the Russians in a more effective manner on this file, but it isn't so much a Russian-US concern, I think.
Pavel Felgenhauer, does Russia use gas as a foreign policy tool?
Well, there were attempts to use it as a foreign policy tool. I wouldn't say that they were overly successful. Russia cut supplies of gas to Georgia, believing that Georgia would crawl back under the Russian mantle, which didn't happen. The Georgians just turned to buying gas from Azerbaijan. And there was, of course, these gas wars with Ukraine and Belarus. Of course, right now, relations, we have a more friendly government in Kiev, but I wouldn't say that the gas wars actually brought change in government in Ukraine. There are other factors. And of course, Russia sells a sizable amount of the gas consumed in Europe is Russian gas, but this is the kind of relations when we don't have other buyers. So I wouldn't say that the control is so big, because there are other suppliers to Europe, but we do not really have Russians other export suppliers than Europe. And so it's a kind of buyer-supplier relationship which has mutual influence on each other. And of course, if relations with the United States indeed sour a bit, Moscow would try to boost its relations with its friends in Europe, with Germany, France, Italy, which were always seen as a kind of counterbalance. When things go bad with Washington, we turn to them. But gas in itself is important, but not that important.
When you say it turns to them, its friends in Europe, does it genuinely see them as equal partners or within its sphere of influence?
No, we see them as an alternative to the United States. And actually, before the invasion of Iraq, there was a kind of sort of alliance formed between Paris, Berlin, and Moscow, which opposed this invasion. It didn't work out into a real alliance, but that's no dream since the Cold War. In Moscow, that when we tried to build solid relations with de Gaulle's France, that we can kind of move Europe away from its close alliance with the United States to a more balanced situation, or actually alliance between Europe and Russia.
Donald Jensen in Washington, D.C., considering now that the president is going to have to tangle with the Republicans over many issues, not just the START treaty, should you think Obama have done much more concerning foreign policy earlier in his administration? Did the administration miscalculate, do you think?
Well, I think they have. And if you mean miscalculate with regard to Russia, definitely. I think the message has been sent, and the administration would deny this, but I think it's undeniable that the message has been sent that in exchange for agreements on Iran, Afghanistan, and on nuclear arms in the START treaty, the U.S. would do a couple of things in return. They would less aggressively promote democracy in Russia. They would give Russia a more free hand in the so-called near abroad, Ukraine and Georgia. And while they go through the motions of talking about democracy, for example, in Ukraine, I think the message has been sent to Moscow that those things are not as high on the agenda as they were under the Bush administration. Thus, this, you might even call it grand bargain. These agreements that they've reached in the past year and a half, now being under question, I think is going to weaken and tend to unravel the entire reset relationship.
Daniel Kurski in London, isn't the main issue underlying the relationship between the US and Russia unilateralism, as in US unilateralism, in that Russia, as the former President Putin put it in 2007, thinks that the US has overstepped its borders in all spheres, economic, political, humanitarian, and has imposed itself on other states. There will be no normalization, if you like, in relations between the US and Russia, no lessening of tension until the US perhaps sees itself not as the world's moral leader, and that all major powers have an equal voice. That's the way that Russia would like it, but that's certainly not the way that the US thinks of itself, is it?
Well, I mean, sitting here in Europe, it looks as if the entire Obama administration has been a sort of sensitive adjustment of the U.S. vision in the world, away from that kind of muscular, unipolar sort of vision of both the world and itself, and towards a more sort of cooperative stance. So I think it's hard to say that the problem remains the U.S. administration's sort of unilateralist stance. But at the same time, it is true that the power that the U.S. has is envied around the world, and not least in Moscow. Yet Prime Minister Vladimir Putin is a pragmatic man, a man who is not, of course, adverse to making larger theoretical statements, but I think is much more concerned about practical realities, advancing Russian interests in the near abroad, helping the economy grow, than philosophize about whether the world is unipolar or multipolar or interpolar. And if I could just add one thing, in this conversation about Russia and the U.S., we mustn't forget China. And the relationship that Russia has with China, one of both economic advantage, but also to some degree of security concern. Very important in the Russian optic, I think.
Pavel Felgenhau, then, Washington's power is envied there in Moscow, according to Daniel. And where does China come into the relationship between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, Russia would want to have, if possible, a better relationship with Washington and with Beijing than they two have between each other. For Russia, China is an opportunity, but also a potential threat. Russian policy towards China is very pragmatic. It's containment through engagement. The more we engage the Chinese, the more probable that we will have a kind of say and lobby in Beijing, and that they, in their growth of power and possible further expansion of power, will not turn on us. But at the same time, Russia knows that it should be very wary about further Chinese intentions and capabilities. So I wouldn't say there were some ideas maybe in the mid-90s by Evgeny Primakov of forming a kind of strategic alliance or something with China. It didn't work out. There were actually, in the first years of President Vladimir Putin, he expressed ideas of having a kind of alliance with the United States, which also didn't work out. With the relations with China are important, but with the United States, it's more important, actually. And this has been very much stated by President Dmitry Medvedev in a big speech this summer to a gathering of Russian ambassadors worldwide, that Russia needs to modernize. It needs to modernize technologically, and for that it has to be very close to the West, and that means to the United States, because United States technology, and especially if we talk about military and military-related and double-use technology, has almost an overlapping veto power on such transfers. And that's another very important physical, pragmatic reason why Russia would want to continue to work to have a good relations with the United States.
Finally, Donald Jensen, where do you see this relationship going in the near term?
I think we've seen the high point of reset, so-called reset, already, and I do hope that further progress can be made. However, I'm not particularly optimistic, in part because I think the next steps in the relationship that would advance the relationship, which are already difficult to fathom, now become even more murkier than ever. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, for example, in Congress now is going to be a much more difficult task, much more difficult bill to repeal, because the Republicans are not going to be as willing to repeal it. The Republicans are likely to push human rights concerns in Russia more than the Democratic Congress did, and the Republicans are in general just more suspicious of Russian actions and motivations than the Democratic Congress was. So I think it's going to be a very difficult road ahead.
Very briefly, very briefly, Daniel, I need you to give me a very quick answer. Are you optimistic about the relationship? Will relations between the US and Russia blossom, or do you think we're in for a rocky road ahead?
I think that they will remain steady. They're not going to blossom. They're not going to develop into something fantastic and much more than they are today, but nor do I think that they're going to deteriorate dramatically. I think there are going to be changes in Russia over the next couple of years that probably will see Vladimir Putin return to the presidency. And of course, it remains to be seen what will happen in Washington politically in the run-up to the next presidential elections. But what I suspect is that we're going to continue, as it were, on an even keel with some bumps on the road, but neither the highs of the past nor the lows of the past.
Gentlemen, thanks for being with us here on this edition of Inside Story. Donald Jensen in Washington, D.C., Daniel Korski in London, and Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.